Tonight, we're stepping away from every image you've ever been handed of the Viking world. The horned helmets, which, by the way, they never actually wore in battle. The mindless pillagers pouring from longships, the snarling warriors who lived only to burn and take. All of that is a story. And like most good stories, it has just enough truth in it to make the lie feel comfortable. The real Viking world was something far stranger, far more human, and in many ways, far more interesting than the legend ever managed to be. Before you settle in completely, if this kind of slow, honest history is something you enjoy, go ahead and like the video. It helps more than you might imagine. And subscribe if you'd like to keep wandering through the past together. I'd genuinely love to know where you're listening from tonight and what the hour looks like outside your window. Drop that in the comments. People tune in from every corner of the world, and there's something quietly wonderful about knowing that. Now, dim the lights. Let the sound of the world outside fade a little. And come with me to a world that existed over 1,000 years ago. A world of smoke and wool, of salted fish and hammered iron, of women with keys at their belts and men who debated law in open fields. Come with me to a Norse morning. Picture the inside of a longhouse just before the light changes. It is perhaps 5 in the morning. The sky outside is the color of cold iron. No windows to speak of, just narrow gaps covered in thin membrane that let in a gray, uncertain glow. The structure around you is immense, stretching perhaps 20 meters from end to end, sometimes longer, its walls bowed outward slightly at the sides in a shape that echoes the hull of a ship. That is not an accident. The people who built this home, and the people who built the boats that carried them across the North Atlantic, used the same hands, the same timber, the same understanding of how a curved frame holds against pressure. The roof above you is turf and thatch, layered thick, alive in the way that old buildings become alive. Grass growing on top, birds sometimes nesting in the eaves. In a hard winter, the insulation this provides is the difference between warmth and freezing. The walls are wooden frames filled with wattle and daub, that ancient mixture of woven branches plastered over with mud and animal dung, then covered sometimes with turf on the outside. It is not elegant by the standards we're used to, but it breathes, it holds heat. It has done this for generations. 2 rows of thick wooden posts run the length of the hall, supporting the roof. Along the walls on either side are raised wooden platforms, benches that serve as seats during the day and sleeping surfaces at night. The family sleeps here together, close together, layered under wool blankets and animal skins. Thralls, the unfree workers who occupied the lowest rung of Norse society, slept toward the far end of the building where the animals were kept through winter. Cattle, sheep, goats, their body heat contributing to the warmth of the hall in a practical arrangement that smelled exactly as you'd expect, but worked. At the center of all of this is the hearth. It is a long, shallow trough of stone running along the floor of the hall, and right now, before dawn, it is more embers than flame. Someone will need to coax it back. Someone will need to stack new wood, blow carefully into the coals, wait for the catch. And when it catches, and it will, the entire longhouse transforms. Light moves across the dark ceiling beams, smoke lifts slowly upward toward the hole in the roof, called a louver, though it never leaves entirely. A faint blue haze always lives somewhere near the top of the space, softening the timbers, making everything look slightly dreamlike. This is what homes smelled like in the Viking Age. Wood smoke, animals, damp wool, salted food, and something harder to name. The accumulated warmth of people living close. The person who rises first, in most longhouses, is the husfreyja. That word translates roughly as the mistress of the house, and it carries more weight than that translation suggests. She is not simply a homemaker in the diminished modern sense of someone who keeps things tidy. She is the manager of everything that happens inside these walls, and in the Viking world, that was a domain of genuine power. At her belt, she wears keys. This is not decorative. These keys open the locked chests and storerooms where the household's valuables are kept. The silver, the fine cloth, the dried provisions that will carry the family through winter, the mead and ale. Control of those keys means control of the household's resources. Archaeologists have found these keys in women's graves across Scandinavia and Iceland, with a remarkable consistency, always worn at the belt, always positioned as objects of identity rather than mere utility. The message encoded in that burial is clear. She was in charge. Norse women could own property independently. They could inherit land, manage finances, and enter contracts without a husband's permission. If a marriage failed, and Norse law was remarkably practical about this, a woman could initiate divorce simply by declaring it before witnesses, once at the front door and once at the bed. Then, reclaiming her dowry and walking away. The reasons that justified divorce were specific and sensible. Consistent failure to provide for the family, violence exceeding what legal tradition defined as acceptable, or a husband who wore women's clothing too often. That last one finds its way into the Icelandic law codes, with a specificity that suggests someone, somewhere, actually needed it written down. The person who rises first, in most longhouses, is the husfreyja. That word translates roughly as the mistress of the house, and it carries more weight than that translation suggests. She is not simply a homemaker in the diminished modern sense of someone who keeps things tidy. She is the manager of everything that happens inside these walls. And in the Viking world, that was a domain of genuine power. At her belt, she wears keys. This is not decorative. These keys open the locked chests and storerooms where the household's valuables are kept. The silver, the fine cloth, the dried provisions that will carry the family through winter, the mead and ale. Control of those keys means control of the household's resources. Archaeologists have found these keys in women's graves across Scandinavia and Iceland with remarkable consistency. Always worn at the belt, always positioned as objects of identity rather than mere utility. The message encoded in that burial is clear. She was in charge. Norse women could own property independently. They could inherit land, manage finances, and enter contracts without a husband's permission. If a marriage failed, and Norse law was remarkably practical about this, a woman could initiate divorce simply by declaring it before witnesses, once at the front door and once at the bed, then reclaiming her dowry and walking away. The reasons that justified divorce were specific and sensible. Consistent failure to provide for the family, violence exceeding what legal tradition defined as acceptable, or a husband who wore women's clothing too often. That last one finds its way into the Icelandic law codes with a specificity that suggests someone, somewhere, actually needed it written down. After divorce, a woman kept what she had brought into the marriage. After widowhood, she retained the household and its resources. This was not radical feminism by modern standards. Norse society had its own hierarchies and limitations, but compared to much of contemporary medieval Europe, Norse women occupied a position of unusual legal and economic autonomy. The husfreyja oversees the textile work that keeps the household clothed and generates tradable goods. Vavmál, a coarse, thick-woven wool, was so economically important in Iceland that it served essentially as currency. Rents, fines, even some church fees were paid in measured lengths of this cloth. The entire process of producing it, from shearing the sheep, washing and carding the fleece, spinning it into thread on a drop spindle, and finally weaving it on a large upright loom, was women's work, and it was serious, skilled, economically vital labor. This morning she moves through the dimness to the hearth, checks the embers, adds wood. Around her, the family stirs slowly. Breakfast in a Norse household was called dagmál, the day meal. It was not elaborate. A pot of porridge made from barley or oats would have been the most common morning offering, ladled into wooden bowls and eaten with dried fruit, perhaps some buttermilk. Children ate this. Adults might also have leftover stew from the night before, the ever-present simmering pot that archaeologists and historians sometimes call skouses, though Norse people called it by various names depending on region and season. It was a rich, thick stew that could contain almost anything available. salted fish, smoked mutton, whatever root vegetables remained in the storeroom. Perhaps some dried mushrooms or wild herbs gathered in autumn. Bread was a daily presence on the Norse table, though it bore little resemblance to what we bake today. Flat and dense, made from barley because wheat was too expensive and difficult to grow in northern climates, it was baked directly on a griddle over the fire, or sometimes on heated stones. It had almost no rise to it. Yeast-leavened bread was a luxury, but it was filling. And when torn and soaked in broth or stew, it became something genuinely satisfying. Dairy products were central to the Norse diet. Milk drunk fresh when available, buttermilk used as a drink and a cooking liquid, and most importantly, skyr. Modern Icelanders still eat sky, and they have every right to claim continuity with their Norse ancestors on this one. It is a thick, high-protein fermented dairy product, something like yogurt, but denser, milder, and more substantial. A staple that provided calories and nutrition in a form that stored reasonably well. Honey was the only sweetener the Norse knew. Sugar was not yet a European commodity, and honey was therefore precious, used to flavor food, to preserve fruits, to brew mead, the fermented honey drink that carried religious significance, as well as pleasure. The Norse kept bees where climate allowed, but imported honey was also a trade good, valuable enough to appear in tribute lists and records of gift-giving between chieftains. Drink at the morning meal was almost certainly ale, not the strong ale of a celebration. Something thinner, weaker, what might be called table ale, safer to drink than untreated water, mildly nourishing given its grain content, and low enough in alcohol that even children could have a small amount without consequence. The Norse brewed from barley primarily, using dried plants called gruit to flavor and preserve the ale before hops came into widespread use. The result would have been earthy, somewhat herbal, and quite different from any beer you'd recognize today. After the morning meal, the work of the day begins, and it is varied. Men who farmed, and most free Norsemen farmed, raiding being seasonal at best and not every man's occupation, would move to the fields, the animal pens, the boat landing. The Norse agricultural cycle was demanding in its own right. Grain had to be sown, tended, and harvested in the narrow window of northern summer. Livestock needed attention year-round. Fishing was continuous along the coasts, with herring, cod, and salmon providing enormous quantities of preserved food through the cold months. Salting and drying fish was an industry, not a household task. The evidence of large-scale drying racks appears in nearly every coastal settlement archaeologists have examined. Ironwork was another constant. The Norse were skilled smiths who produced not just weapons and farm tools, but a remarkable variety of everyday objects: locks and keys, needles and pins, cooking vessels, decorative fittings for clothing and horses. The forge was a place of heat and noise and considerable skill, and a good blacksmith occupied an important social position in any community. Woodworking was equally essential. From the massive ship timbers that required years of careful selection and shaping, to the smaller craft of furniture, storage chests, tool handles, and the intricate carved decorations that covered everything from building posts to the prows of ships. Norse wood carving was not merely decorative. It told stories, encoded cosmology, recorded genealogy. The ability to carve was admired and valued in ways that placed skilled craftsmen among the most respected members of their communities. Women worked continuously through all of this, not only at the textile production that was their primary economic contribution, but managing the dairy, supervising food preservation, overseeing the education and care of children, directing the labor of thralls. When men were absent, away on trading voyages, on seasonal raids, at the Thing assembly, the farm was hers to manage entirely. This was not occasional. It was expected, planned for, and Norse women were prepared for it. Let us pause here to talk about something that surprises almost everyone: Viking hygiene. The popular image of the unwashed, reeking barbarian is almost perfectly backwards when it comes to the Norse. Contemporary sources, people who actually met Vikings, and some of them were not fans, consistently remarked on how clean they were compared to other Europeans of the era. A 12th century English chronicler named John of Wallingford wrote with evident irritation about Norse settlers in England. His complaint was not that they were dirty. His complaint was the opposite, that they combed their hair every day, bathed every week, and changed their clothes frequently, and that these habits made them too acceptable to English women, attractive even to the wives and daughters of Englishmen. He found this deeply objectionable. We find it revealing. The Norse called Saturday laggerdag, literally, washing day. Weekly bathing was not an occasional luxury. It was a cultural expectation, built into the very naming of the day. In Scandinavia, where wood was plentiful and rivers were cold, the sauna, a small heated bathing structure, was the standard method. You would heat the room with stones, pour water to create steam, scrub down thoroughly, and then often plunge into cold water afterward. This practice was so common and so ingrained that Norse settlers brought sauna culture with them wherever they settled, including Iceland and the settlements at the eastern limits of their reach. Personal grooming tools appear in Norse graves with such regularity that they clearly functioned as important personal possessions. Combs carved from bone or antler were carried in small leather pouches, kept close at hand. Tweezers, nail cleaners, ear picks, and razors have been found at sites from Norway to Russia to Newfoundland. These were not luxury goods. They were standard equipment for daily life. The Norse apparently cared considerably about their appearance, and the archaeological record makes it impossible to dismiss this. Ibn Fadlan, the 10th century Arab diplomat and writer who famously encountered Norse traders, the Rus, along the Volga River, did criticize what he saw as their practice of communal washing from a shared basin. His objection was about the sharing, not the washing. These men, he noted, washed their faces and hair every morning. He found the communal bowl unsanitary by his own Islamic standards of running water. But even in his criticism, the baseline is clear. The Vikings were washing. There is even evidence that the Norse used a form of soap, a mixture of animal fat and the alkaline lye produced by washing ash, to clean both their bodies and their hair. And Viking men, it appears, were not above using that same lye soap to lighten their hair to a paler blonde, a color that was culturally valued and associated with beauty and perhaps something of the divine. Midday in a Norse longhouse often saw the household gathered again, briefly, for work that required the space or the light. Textile production happened here. Harness repair, the braiding of rope, the mending of nets. Children were not kept separate from adult work. They participated from an early age, assigned small tasks, observed and learned by proximity. This was how knowledge transferred, not through formal instruction in most cases, but through immersion in the daily rhythms of skilled labor. The afternoon meal, or nattmal, the night meal, though it was eaten in the late afternoon or early evening, was the main meal of the day. This is where the household's best efforts came together. A proper nattmal might include a rich fish or meat stew with root vegetables and herbs, fresh bread if grain was not too scarce, dried fruits sweetened with honey, and a more substantial drink, stronger ale, or on occasion mead. The meat on the Norse table came from cattle, sheep, pigs, and occasionally horses. Horses being reserved for ritual sacrifice and special consumption rather than everyday eating in most periods. Chicken was kept and its eggs used constantly. Along the coasts and rivers, fish dominated. Herring was eaten fresh in summer and preserved for the rest of the year. Cod was dried into a hard substance called stockfish that could be stored almost indefinitely and then reconstituted in water, or just gnawed as a traveling food. Whales, when available, were a major source of fat and protein. Their flesh divided among communities in ways that reflected social hierarchy and practical cooperation. Wild food supplemented the cultivated diet significantly. Berry picking in late summer was a community effort that produced lingonberries, bilberries, and cloudberries in quantities sufficient for preservation. Hazelnuts were gathered and stored. Wild apples and other fruits, mushrooms, waterfowl eggs in season. The Norse were not choosy and they were skilled at extracting what the land offered. The Norse relationship with the sea shaped everything, not just the famous raiding and exploration, but the quieter reality of trade. Trade, in fact, was the more constant occupation for most Norse people who engaged with the wider world. The image of the Viking as primarily a raider is drawn from the chronicles of the monasteries and coastal communities that suffered their attacks, which is to say, it reflects the experiences of victims, not the self-understanding of most Norse people, who were farmers and traders first. The major Norse trading centers were among the largest urban settlements in northern Europe. Hedeby, in what is now northern Germany, sat at the junction of land routes across the Danish peninsula and sea routes into the Baltic. At its height, in the 9th and 10th centuries, it held perhaps 1,000 permanent residents, a significant number for an era when most settlements numbered in the dozens, and processed goods from across the known world. Its harbor filled with boats from Francia, from the British Isles, from the emerging trading states of the Slavic East. Birka, in Sweden, served a similar function for Baltic and Eastern trade. Kaupang in Norway and Ribe in Denmark were among the earliest Scandinavian towns, established specifically to facilitate commerce. What the Norse brought to trade was distinctive. Furs, the high-quality pelts of Arctic animals including sable, fox, and beaver that wealthy Europeans and Arab elites could not obtain elsewhere. Amber, gathered on Baltic beaches and valued everywhere for its beauty and supposed protective properties. Walrus ivory, carved tusks from the Arctic that provided an alternative to elephant ivory when African supply routes were disrupted. Honey and beeswax, dried fish in enormous quantities, and enslaved people. A trade that is uncomfortable to acknowledge, but was economically central to the Norse world, as it was to most of the medieval world. In return, the Norse obtained silver, primarily in the form of Arabic dirhams, the coins of the Abbasid Caliphate flowing up through trade routes along the Volga and Dnieper rivers. The quantities were staggering. Archaeologists have recovered more than 80,000 Arabic silver coins from the island of Gotland alone, with tens of thousands more from mainland Sweden. This was not occasional contact. This was sustained, intensive commercial engagement between Scandinavia and the Islamic world over a period of centuries. The eastern trade routes are one of the great unsung stories of Norse history. Swedish Vikings, traveling east rather than west, established trading settlements along the river systems of what is now Russia and Ukraine. They called these settlements Novgorod, Staraya Ladoga, and eventually Kiev, the foundations of what would become Kievan Rus, and ultimately the Russian state. They navigated the Volga down to the Caspian Sea, trading directly with merchants from Persia and the Abbasid Caliphate. They navigated the Dnieper to reach Constantinople, the greatest city in the Christian world, where they served as elite mercenaries in the Varangian Guard of the Byzantine Emperor. A treaty signed in 907 CE between the Rus Vikings and the Byzantine Empire contains, among its practical provisions, a remarkable detail: the right of Norse traders visiting Constantinople to use the city's public bathhouses. The fact that this was worth specifying in an international treaty tells us something important about how seriously the Norse took their access to bathing facilities, even when far from home. The Norse did not simply export goods and bring back silver. They brought back ideas, techniques, textiles, and technologies. Chinese silk has been found in Viking-age graves in Sweden, carried there through the Silk Road trading networks that connected the Norse commercial sphere to the farthest reaches of the known world. Indian gemstones have been identified at Norse sites. Byzantine glasswork, Persian metalwork, and Frankish wine all made their way into longhouses across Scandinavia through these trading networks. The economy within Norse communities was not yet fully monetized. Silver was used, but it was weighed rather than counted. A merchant carried scales and weights and would cut coins into smaller pieces to achieve the right measure for a transaction. Goods also exchanged directly: livestock, grain, vadmal cloth, iron tools, all functioned as media of exchange in a world where coin money was valuable, but not the only form of value. Late afternoon, before the Natmal, was often when the community gathered beyond the individual longhouse. Norse settlements were not isolated farmsteads in most cases, but clusters of households connected by kinship, alliance, and the practical need for cooperation. Neighbors helped with major agricultural tasks. Young people moved between households for their education. It was common for children of respectable families to be fostered in other households, building networks of obligation and loyalty that would sustain them as adults. The community was genuinely a community, porous and interconnected in ways that modern isolation makes hard to imagine. At the center of communal life was the thing. The thing, the word itself simply means assembly, was the institution through which free Norse men governed themselves. Local things met regularly, perhaps monthly, to handle disputes, make decisions about community resources, and maintain the social order. Regional things gathered less frequently, and at the apex of the system, in Iceland, the All Thing, the All Assembly, met every summer at a place called Langvættir, the Plains of the Assembly, for 2 weeks during which the entire political and legal life of the island society was conducted. The Althing was established in 930 CE, making it one of the oldest functioning democratic institutions in the world. It still exists today as Iceland's national parliament. The central figure at these assemblies was the Lögsögumaður, the law speaker. Before writing was widely used, the law speaker memorized the entire body of Norse law and recited it publicly over the course of the assembly's session. This was not symbolic. This was how law was transmitted and preserved, through the disciplined memory and public performance of a single elected individual who served for 3 years at a time. The law itself was sophisticated. The body of Icelandic law, eventually written down in the 12th century, known as Grey Goose, fills multiple volumes. It addressed everything from property rights and inheritance to the procedures for divorce, from the proper conduct of debt collection to the rules governing holmgang, the regulated dueling practice that allowed individuals to settle disputes through combat under controlled conditions. Holmgang was eventually abolished. Iceland banned it in 16 CE, Norway in 1014. A detail that tells us Norse society was capable of recognizing when a legal practice had become more harmful than helpful, and changing it. The thing was open to all free men and women with legitimate standing, widows, for instance, or women acting on behalf of incapacitated relatives, could attend and speak. The proceedings were not secret. Everything was public, conducted in the open air before whoever cared to witness it. This transparency was a feature, not an accident. Law that everyone could observe was law that everyone could hold to account. The concept of wergild, man price or compensation, lay at the heart of Norse legal practice. Rather than imprisonment, which was practically impossible in a dispersed rural society, most offenses were addressed through payments made to the victims or their families. The amounts were carefully calibrated. Different prices for different injuries, different prices for people of different social status. A free man's death cost more than a thrall's. A nobleman's eye cost more than a farmer's eye. This was not equality by modern standards, but it was system, and it provided a practical alternative to the blood feuds that could otherwise destroy entire communities through cycles of retaliatory violence. The most severe legal punishment the Norse had was outlawry. A full outlaw, skogangur, meaning one who goes into the forest, had no legal status whatsoever. Their property was confiscated. They could be killed by anyone without legal consequence. They were excluded entirely from human society. This was exile in the most absolute sense, not just from a place, but from humanity's protection. Some famous outlaws, including Eric the Red, who was outlawed from Iceland for manslaughter and proceeded to settle Greenland, managed to turn this exclusion into something like a new beginning. But for most, outlawry meant slow death. The longhouse itself was not a single universal design. It evolved across region and century, adapted to available materials and local climate. Icelandic longhouses built by settlers who arrived in the late 9th century. Refugees from the political consolidation happening under Harald Fairhair in Norway had to contend with a landscape almost entirely devoid of trees. Timber was precious in Iceland in a way it was not in Norway. So the Icelandic longhouse became increasingly turf-built, its walls not just covered with turf but composed primarily of it. Thick blocks of cut sod stacked in elaborate double-wall constructions that provided remarkable insulation against the punishing North Atlantic winters. At Stone, in the Fjordsardalur Valley, a 10th century farmstead was buried by volcanic ash from the eruption of Hekla in 1104 CE. Iceland's version of Pompeii, preserved in catastrophe. Archaeologists excavating the site in the 20th century found an essentially intact floor plan, a main hall roughly 15 meters long, an attached dairy building, a small privy at the back. The walls were turf, nearly a meter thick. The floor was packed earth. The benches along the walls were still in place, their outline preserved in the ash. This was not a wealthy farm. It was a functioning, middle-class Norse household, the kind that constituted the backbone of Icelandic settlement society. Other sites tell different stories. At Borg, in the Lofoten Islands of northern Norway, archaeologists excavated a longhouse that stretched an extraordinary 83 meters, one of the longest ever discovered. This was the residence of a powerful chieftain, its scale intended to communicate status and to accommodate the large household retinue and the guests that political importance required. The Hall of a Great Man was the physical expression of his power. At Lance aux Meadows in Newfoundland, the only confirmed Norse settlement site in North America, the longhouses are modest, purpose-built for a temporary expedition rather than permanent settlement. They lack the refinements of Scandinavian domestic spaces. No evidence of carved decoration, no elaborate grave goods, no signs of the ritual deposits that mark permanent homes. These were buildings that served a function for a season or a few years, then were abandoned when the expedition returned home or failed. The people who built them knew they would not stay. Food preservation deserves its own sustained attention, because it was not simply a practical matter in the Norse world. It was a seasonal emergency management system that determined whether you lived or died before the next harvest. The Norse calendar was organized fundamentally around the problem of winter. Summer's abundance had to be converted, through labor and skill, into forms that would survive the months when nothing grew. Every technique available was pressed into service. Salting was the most important preservation method for meat and fish. Salt was not produced domestically in most of Scandinavia. It had to be traded for, and it was expensive enough to represent a genuine household investment. Fish were salted and packed into barrels for storage, where they were dried in the wind and cold air of northern autumn, hung on racks that stood near every coastal settlement, turning the fish into the hard, almost wooden substance of stockfish. Stockfish needed no salt and no cool temperatures. Properly dried, it could last for years, and it was reconstituted simply by soaking it in water before cooking. It was the Norse equivalent of canned food, and it sustained long sea voyages, winter households, and trading expeditions in equal measure. Smoking was used for both meat and fish, particularly in areas where salt was scarcer. The smokehouse was a common outbuilding at Norse farmsteads, a small structure designed to maintain cool, smoke-saturated air around hanging carcasses of fish for extended periods. The wood used for smoking mattered. Different woods produced different flavors and different preservation qualities. Juniper, birch, and various other northern woods each contributed distinctive characteristics. Fermentation was used for dairy products, for cabbage and other vegetables when available, and for some fish preparations. The Norse were not alone in their use of fermented fish, which appears across northern cultures in which modern Scandinavians still produce, to the bewilderment of most visitors. The smell is extreme. The flavor is intensely complex. The preservation is excellent. Dairy products were preserved through the making of cheese and through sky production, both of which converted fresh milk, which spoiled within hours, in warm conditions, into stable forms that could last weeks or months. Under cool conditions, butter was salted and packed into wooden barrels, or, in a practice found archaeologically in Ireland and Scotland as well, buried in peat bogs, where the cool, acidic, anaerobic conditions provided extraordinary preservation. Bog butter recovered from Irish sites is sometimes centuries old, and reportedly still technically edible. Root vegetables were stored in cool underground pits or cellars, where temperatures remained consistently low enough to slow spoilage. Onions, turnips, parsnips, and carrots could survive several months in these conditions. Cabbage could be fermented into something like sauerkraut. Dried legumes, peas and beans, kept almost indefinitely and provided protein through the winter months. The management of this stored food was the husfrey's responsibility, and it was a responsibility that required genuine expertise. Too aggressive in dispensing provisions early in the winter, and the household ran short before spring. Too conservative, and people went hungry now to preserve an abundance that might spoil before they needed it. Reading the stores, calibrating consumption, deciding when the situation required supplementing the household's own food with purchased or traded goods. This was economic management of a high order, performed by women who are not remembered in the histories, but whose competence was the difference between life and death for everyone in the longhouse. The Norse possessed a legal concept that has no perfect modern equivalent: need. Need was a specific form of insult targeted at a man's masculine virtue that carried legal consequences. To accuse someone of need, to claim they had submitted sexually to another man, or to construct verse that portrayed them as passive, cowardly, or unmanned in other ways, was not merely offensive, it was actionable. A man subjected to need poetry could demand legal satisfaction. The person who had composed or spread it could be declared an outlaw. This tells us something important about Norse social life. Reputation was not merely a matter of personal pride. It was a legal category, something that the community enforced, and that could be destroyed or defended through formal processes. The Thing assembly was not only for resolving disputes about land or injury, it was also the venue through which social standing was publicly contested and maintained. The importance of reputation meant that the Norse invested heavily in gift-giving, hospitality, and public displays of generosity. A chieftain who failed to provide lavishly for his followers, who kept his silver for himself instead of distributing it at feasts and in response to requests, who sent guests away without appropriate gifts. Such a man was failing at a core social obligation. His reputation would suffer, his followers would drift toward more generous patrons. His political power would erode. The great gold arm rings that appear in treasure hoards and grave goods across the Norse world were not primarily jewelry in the modern sense. They were instruments of political economy, gifts that bound recipient to giver in webs of obligation, visual demonstrations of a chieftain's wealth and willingness to share it, promises of loyalty converted into gold. When a sworn follower received a ring from his lord's own arm, he received both a valuable object and a public declaration that he was trusted and valued. To refuse such a gift, or to accept one and then betray the giver, was not merely social failure. It was a form of sacrilege. The gods moved through the Norse world not as distant abstractions, but as immediate, personal presences. Thor was invoked specifically in matters of weather, farming, and protection against harmful forces. Miniature Mjolnir pendants, Thor's hammer, the symbol of his protective power, have been found by the thousands at Norse sites, worn by men, women, and children alike. They are the functional equivalent of the Christian cross, a portable statement of spiritual allegiance and a request for ongoing protection. When Christianity arrived in Scandinavia and people began converting, there is archaeological evidence of a transitional period in which the same individuals wore both a hammer pendant and a cross, hedging their spiritual bets, maintaining relationships with both the old powers and the new one until it became clear which would prevail. Odin was invoked in matters of wisdom, strategy, and poetic inspiration, and his worship was tinged with a danger that Thor's was not. Odin was capricious, demanding, willing to sacrifice anything, including his followers, to gain knowledge or achieve his purposes. He was the god of the aristocratic and the intellectual, of warriors who accepted that victory might come at the cost of everything. Stories of Odin are often uncomfortable. He deceives, he breaks promises, He sacrifices what is precious to obtain what is necessary. The Norse worshipped him, or perhaps did not entirely trust him. Freyr and Freya were the gods of fertility, abundance, and love. The deities most immediately relevant to daily agricultural life and the cycles of season and generation. Freyr's ritual symbol was the phallus, his worship associated with sacrifices aimed at ensuring the crops grew and the animals multiplied. Freya was associated with cats, with amber jewelry, with the seether magic that was largely her domain, and with the kind of desire that could be productive or destructive depending on how it was channeled. At the local level, Norse households maintained relationships with landvættir, land spirits, whose goodwill was essential to agricultural success. Before entering harbor after a long voyage, sailors were expected to remove the carved animal heads from their ship's prows so as not to frighten the spirits of the land they were approaching. Before plowing, offerings might be made to the spirits of the field. Before building, to the spirits of the site. This was not formal religion in the sense of organized institutional practice. It was the daily management of relationships with the non-human presences that shared the world. Evening in the longhouse meant the gathering of everyone under the same roof. The napmau concluded, the meal cleared away, the fire was built back up to its full heat. This was the social heart of the day. Sagas were told, long, complex narrative histories of ancestors and heroes, genealogies interwoven with myth, episodes of law and love and violence that carried moral weight and provided models for behavior. The word saga simply means something said or told, and the tradition was oral before it was written, maintained through performance in precisely these evening gatherings. Music was present, lyres and horns and framed drums, the rhythms of skaldic poetry that required extraordinary memorization and verbal skill. Skalds, the Norse poets, occupied a high social position because they were the keepers of reputation, the recorders of glory and shame. To be celebrated in skaldic verse was to have your name preserved. To be satirized was a serious social injury. Some forms of verbal attack were actually illegal under Norse law. There were specific provisions against neath, a kind of deeply insulting satirical verse that impugned a man's courage or masculinity. Dice and board games provided entertainment. The Norse played Henafadafall, a strategy game something like chess, but older and distinctly Norse, in which an outnumbered king attempted to reach safety while an attacking force tried to capture him. The game has been found at sites across the Norse world, its pieces recovered from graves and refuse deposits alike, testifying to how widely it was played and how much it was valued. The ale moved around the hall. Mead was brought out on significant occasions. The social ritual of drinking followed specific protocols. Toasts were made to the gods, to the dead, to the host's health, and the community's prosperity. Refusing a toast was a social slight. Drinking in company was not just pleasure. It was the physical enactment of community bonds, the repeated affirmation that these people chose to share their warmth and their table. Sleep, when it came collectively. The benches along the walls held the family, guests, workers, everyone arranged in the darkness under the smoke-hazed ceiling. The fire was banked, not extinguished, a carefully managed ember that would survive until morning, ready to be coaxed back. Outside, the Norse world went on in all its darkness and cold, its navigable seas and impossible winters, its gods walking invisible in the storm. But in here, in the longhouse, everything necessary for human life was present. What the daily life of the Norse reveals, when we look at it honestly, is not the violent outsiders of popular imagination, but something more complicated and more interesting. A society that had solved certain problems with remarkable elegance. Their law was sophisticated and publicly accountable. Their women held genuine economic and legal power in a world that mostly denied women both. Their hygiene put contemporary Europeans to shame. Their trade networks connected them to the wealth of 3 continents. Their oral tradition preserved history, law, genealogy, and cosmology across generations without relying on widespread literacy. Their maritime technology took them to North America 500 years before Columbus, established trading empires from Ireland to Baghdad, and shaped the political geography of Russia, Ukraine, England, Normandy, and Sicily. They were also people who kept slaves, who conducted raids that destroyed communities, who practiced human sacrifice, who lived in a hierarchical society in which your birth determined much of what you could ever become. Both of these things are true, and holding them together is what honest history requires. The Viking Age lasted roughly from 793 CE. The raid on Lindisfarne that first announced Norse military power to a horrified Europe, to somewhere around 1100 CE, when Christianization, political consolidation, and shifting trade routes transformed Scandinavian society into something recognizably different from what had come before. 3 centuries in which a relatively small population at the edge of the known world managed to leave permanent marks on the languages, laws, place names, and genetic heritage of half the world. They were not superhumans. They were not monsters. They were people who woke up in smoky longhouses, ate porridge and salted fish, argued about land rights at outdoor assemblies, combed their hair every morning, worried about the winter, told stories in the firelight, and tried, like all of us, to make something of the time they had. The Norse called their world Midgardr, middle world, the realm of human beings, suspended between Asgardr above and Niflheimr below, threaded through with the roots of Yggdrasil, the world tree that bound everything together. They understood themselves as existing in a web of relationship that extended in every direction, backward through the ancestors, forward through the unborn, sideways through the community of the living, and upward and downward through the gods and the dead and the spirits that shared the world. Every Norse child was named in a ceremony that gave them a place in this web, often named for a dead ancestor, the same soul perhaps arriving again, the continuity of the family expressed in the repetition of names across generations. Every threshold of a longhouse was a threshold between the human world and something larger, which is why it needed guarding. Every birth and death was a movement through that larger web, in and out of Midgardr, into whatever came before and after. We have different frameworks now for understanding where we are and what connects us, but the feeling that underlies the Norse cosmology, the feeling of being held in something larger than individual life, threaded through time, connected to both the dead and the unborn. That feeling is not exclusively theirs. It is available to anyone willing to sit quietly for a moment and feel the full weight of how many people, in how many longhouses and apartments and mud brick houses and canvas tents, have banked the fire at the end of a long day and settled into sleep. There is a particular kind of peace that comes from understanding people across the distance of 1,000 years, not the peace of resolution. Their world is gone, most of their questions never answered, but the peace of recognition. The fire in the longhouse hearth and the light you're reading or listening by right now exist in the same unbroken chain of human warmth passed forward through all the generations that came between. They kept the fire going, so do we. If this journey through the Norse daily world has given you something worth keeping, some warmth from a hearth that has been cold for 1,000 years, some recognition in a culture that seemed at first entirely foreign, then this was a good evening well spent. If you'd like to keep exploring history like this, quietly and without hurry, a like and a subscription would mean a great deal. And wherever you are tonight, whether you found this through a recommendation, a search, or some stranger's passing mention, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Tell me where you're tuning in from and what drew you here. Sleep well. The longhouse is quiet now. The fire is down to embers. The Norse sky above is enormous and full of stars. The same ones they navigated by, the same ones visible from wherever you are reading or listening tonight. We'll pick up another thread next time.